There's a category of weapon that 10 years ago would have sounded like something out of a screenwriter's pitch meeting. A small, unmanned boat, no crew, no reason to ever come home, that can sit off a hostile coastline for hours, decide what it's looking at, and then turn itself into the weapon. That's not a hypothetical anymore. That's a confirmed, on-the-record combat operation that just happened in the Strait of Hormuz, and it's the first time the United States has ever used it this way against Iran. And I mean that literally when I say it shouldn't exist yet. At least, not in the way most people picture modern warfare working. We're used to thinking about naval combat as destroyers, fighter jets, submarines, big expensive platforms with sailors and pilots on board making split-second decisions. What just happened in the Gulf is a quieter, stranger shift than that. A robotic boat with nobody aboard, making its own way toward a target it was never going to return from, and doing real, confirmed damage once it got there. That's the kind of thing that used to only exist in defense contractor pitch decks and think tank white papers. Now it's a line item in an actual CENTCOM combat statement. Let's actually walk through what happened, because the details here matter more than the headline. On July 12, 2026, U.S. Central Command confirmed a new wave of strikes against Iranian military targets, and buried inside that confirmation was a single line that changed the character of this entire war. Alongside fighter aircraft, naval vessels, and one-way attack aerial drones, the United States used, for the first time in combat, one-way attack sea drones. Sit with that phrase for a second, because I don't think it gets the attention it deserves. Explosive unmanned surface vessels have become a recognizable weapon over the last couple of years, mostly because of what Ukraine did with them against Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Everyone watched that story unfold. Small, cheap, uncrewed boats forcing warships worth hundreds of millions of dollars to either run or die. What almost nobody was talking about was the fact that the United States Navy was quietly watching that exact same lesson and building its own version of it. July 12th is the night that program stopped being a program. It became an actual weapon fired in anger. Here's what it actually hit. CENTCOM's own statement lists the targets, air defense systems, coastal radar sites, missile and drone assets, and fast attack boats belonging to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That's not a random target list. That's a deliberate attempt to take apart something military planners call the maritime kill chain. And understanding what that phrase actually means is the key to understanding why this specific weapon matters so much more than its size would suggest. Think about how Iran actually threatens a ship moving through the Strait of Hormuz. It's not one system doing all the work, it's a sequence. Coastal radar has to detect the vessel first. Surveillance drones or patrol boats then confirm what they're looking at and refine the targeting picture. That information gets fed to a command center which processes it and decides which weapon system actually gets the firing order. Only then do missile batteries or fast attack boats actually execute the attack. Break any single link in that chain and the whole sequence stalls. An anti-ship missile battery with a perfectly good missile still can't hit a moving tanker if nothing upstream can tell it exactly where that tanker is. That's why this operation didn't just go after missile launchers directly. It went after the radar sites and surveillance assets that make those launchers useful in the first place. And that's a far more efficient way to disable an entire defensive network than trying to destroy every individual weapon in it one at a time. That's really the difference between a strike campaign built around body counts and one built around systems thinking. If you spend a night destroying 5 missile launchers, Iran can, and reportedly has in other parts of this war, quietly reconstitute or reposition replacements over the following weeks. But if you destroy the radar site 50 of those launchers, all depend on for targeting data, you haven't just removed one node, you've temporarily blinded an entire sector of coastline at once. That's a much higher return on a single strike, and it explains why American planners keep going back to the same category of target, radar, surveillance, command infrastructure, instead of chasing every individual weapon system across the country, one at a time. Suppressing Iranian air defense radar produces a second-order benefit on top of that. Reduced radar coverage gives American aircraft more freedom to run follow-on strikes against missile sites, command centers, and naval facilities, while lowering the risk that a fighter or bomber runs into an active surface-to-air missile system it didn't know was still online. So this single operation is quietly doing 2 jobs at once, degrading Iran's ability to track ships in the Strait right now, and making every strike that comes after it in this campaign safer for the air crews flying it. Now, let's talk about why the sea drone itself is the part of this story that actually deserves the shouldn't exist framing. A destroyer costs well over $1 billion and takes years to build. Losing one, even a smaller patrol craft, means losing sailors, and that's a cost no commander wants to absorb over something like a coastal radar station. A one-way attack sea drone flips that entire cost equation. It's small. It's relatively inexpensive to produce compared to the assets it's replacing, and if it gets destroyed on the way in, nobody comes home in a casket. That single fact changes what kind of missions a commander is willing to authorize. Targets that used to require either accepting real risk to a crewed vessel or spending an expensive standoff missile that could be needed somewhere else can now be handed to an autonomous system that was never going to survive the mission anyway, because it was never designed to come back. Think about what that actually does to a commander's decision-making process on any given night. Before this capability existed, hitting a lightly defended coastal radar site meant weighing the value of that target against the cost of putting a crewed vessel or an expensive missile at risk to get it. A lot of smaller, lower priority targets simply weren't worth that trade, so they sat there, degraded but functional, quietly contributing to Iran's overall surveillance picture. Now that calculation barely exists, if the weapon doing the job was never going to survive the mission regardless of what happens, and it costs a fraction of the alternative, there's very little reason not to authorize the strike. That's not just a tactical change, it's a change in what actually gets treated as worth hitting in the first place. And it means targets that used to survive by simply not being valuable enough to risk a crew over are no longer safe by that same logic. And these things aren't just floating explosives with no intelligence behind them. Equipped with navigation systems, electro-optical sensors, and autonomous guidance, one-way attack sea drones can also do reconnaissance, identify hostile naval activity, and support target acquisition even before they ever detonate. Used alongside aerial drones, they create simultaneous threats approaching from two completely different directions at once, sea level and air, which forces a defender to split attention and defensive systems across two axes instead of one. That's a meaningful tactical advantage in a place like the Strait of Hormuz, where narrow shipping lanes, scattered islands, and a coastline that sits right up against the water already make this one of the most cramped, complicated naval battle spaces on the planet. Small, agile, low-signature vessels are actually built for exactly that kind of environment in a way a destroyer simply isn't. That dual-purpose design, reconnaissance, and strike, bundled into a single expendable hull, is actually one of the more understated parts of why this capability is so hard to plan against. A traditional strike weapon and a traditional reconnaissance asset are usually two separate categories of hardware, built for two separate missions, and a defender who understands one doesn't necessarily understand the other. Collapsing both roles into a single vessel means a defender watching a suspicious contact approach doesn't actually know, in the moment, whether they're looking at something purely gathering information or something about to detonate against a specific target. That ambiguity alone forces a more cautious, resource-intensive response than either mission would require on its own, which is exactly the kind of pressure that wears down a defender's ability to respond efficiently over a long campaign. And this didn't come out of nowhere either. The Navy's Task Force 59 has spent the last several years pairing unmanned surface vehicles with artificial intelligence, specifically to expand what the military calls its eyes and ears across the Middle East. And reporting indicates similar efforts are now being rolled out in the Pacific, and across Central and South America as well. That's an important detail, because it tells you July 12th wasn't an improvised wartime experiment. It was the live combat debut of a program that's been quietly maturing for years, tested, refined, and waiting for exactly the kind of operational moment this war provided. It's worth understanding what Task Force 59 was actually built to do in the first place, because it wasn't originally conceived as a strike unit at all. Its early mission was surveillance and reconnaissance, using unmanned vessels equipped with sensors and artificial intelligence to expand how much ocean the Navy could actually watch at once without needing a crewed ship physically present in every square mile of contested water. That's a fundamentally defensive, information-gathering mission. Turning that same underlying technology into a strike weapon is a genuinely significant evolution, because it means the sensors, the navigation, and the autonomous decision-making that used to exist purely to watch and report are now also capable of closing the loop and actually delivering a payload. That's the difference between a reconnaissance program and a strike program, and crossing that line quietly inside an active shooting war is exactly the kind of development that deserves more attention than it's currently getting. There's also a specific vessel worth knowing about by name because it's very likely part of this same lineage. Reuters reported in late March that a new uncrewed surface vessel called Gark had already been used earlier in this war during Operation Epic Fury. Built by Maritime Applied Physics Corp., it's a 16-foot craft the Navy had been quietly testing for a couple of years before this conflict started, including a pause in mid-2025 after one of the test vessels flipped during evaluation. That's worth remembering, because it tells you this technology didn't arrive in this war fully polished. It arrived after a real bumpy development process, including at least one embarrassing setback, and it still made it to the front line in time to become a first-of-its-kind combat weapon. That's actually a pretty normal story arc for military technology: messy testing, occasional failure, and then a sudden real-world debut once a conflict actually calls for it. That kind of quiet, unglamorous development history matters, because it's easy to watch a headline like this one and assume the Pentagon simply flipped a switch on some secret superweapon overnight. The real story is almost always slower and messier than that. Years of incremental testing, budget requests, the occasional embarrassing failure like a boat flipping during evaluation, long stretches where a program barely makes the news at all, and then, eventually, a moment where an active war creates exactly the conditions that program was quietly built for. That's not a less impressive story than the overnight superweapon version. If anything, it's a more honest one, and understanding that development arc is part of understanding why this capability is showing up now specifically, rather than at some earlier, more dramatic-sounding announcement. So why can't Iran stop it? Start with the most basic problem, detection. A destroyer has a massive radar cross-section. A fighter jet, even a stealthy one, still has to contend with radar systems built specifically to hunt aircraft. A small, autonomous surface vessel, sitting low in the water, moving at speeds that don't necessarily stand out from ordinary small boat traffic in a crowded waterway like the Strait of Hormuz, is a genuinely different detection problem. Iran's coastal radar network, the same network this operation specifically targeted, was built and tuned over years to watch for larger surface combatants and aircraft. It was never optimized against a swarm of small, low-signature disposable boats approaching at wave height. And even where a radar operator does pick something up, distinguishing a hostile autonomous vessel from ordinary maritime traffic in real time under combat conditions with degraded systems from the same night's strikes is a genuinely difficult tracking problem, not a simple one. Put yourself in the position of an Iranian radar operator on watch that night. Your screen is already showing a chaotic picture. Degraded sensors from earlier strikes, ordinary fishing and cargo traffic that never stops moving through one of the busiest waterways on the planet, and now, somewhere in that noise, one or more small autonomous vessels approaching a target you don't even know is a target yet. There's no obvious signature that screams weapon the way an incoming missile or a fighter jet's radar return does. By the time anyone realizes what they're actually looking at, the vessel may already be close enough that intercepting it, rather than simply detecting it, becomes the much harder problem. Second, there's the doctrine problem. Air defense doctrine, the tactics, procedures, and decision trees that an operator actually falls back on under pressure, takes years to build and refine. Iran has spent decades building doctrine against aircraft, against cruise missiles, against larger naval vessels. It has not had years to build doctrine against autonomous surface vessels used offensively at scale, because until a few weeks ago, essentially, nobody had used them this way against Iran specifically. You can't improvise mature counter-doctrine in the middle of an active war. That takes training cycles, equipment procurement, and lessons learned from failures, none of which Iran has had time for here. That's actually a broader pattern worth noticing across this entire war, not just with sea drones specifically. Nearly every genuinely new capability introduced so far, the bunker busters against underground missile sites, the directed energy systems deployed on Navy destroyers, and now these autonomous strike vessels, has landed against a defender that's had to improvise a response in real time rather than prepare for it years in advance the way the offense did. That's not a coincidence. That's what it looks like when one side has spent a decade quietly developing a specific category of weapon, and the other side is encountering it for the first time under fire. Third, and maybe most importantly, there's the economics of loss. Even if Iran manages to destroy one of these vessels on a given night, that's a trade the United States can absorb far more easily than losing a crewed patrol boat or a fighter jet. No pilot goes home to a grieving family. No sailor's name goes on a casualty report. That asymmetry means American commanders can afford to keep sending these vessels into contested, dangerous, close-to-shore environments in a way that simply wasn't true before this specific capability existed. And that persistence, showing up again and again with something cheap enough to lose, is exactly the kind of pressure that grinds down a defender's confidence over time. There's a psychological dimension to that persistence that's easy to underestimate. A defender who successfully shoots down an incoming missile gets a clear, immediate confirmation that the system worked. A defender facing repeated waves of cheap, expendable autonomous vessels doesn't get that same clean sense of success, because even a successful intercept just means one more expendable asset is gone, with more likely to follow the next night, and the night after that. Sustained pressure from something the defender knows the attacker can afford to keep losing is a genuinely different kind of psychological burden than defending against a smaller number of expensive, precious weapons the attacker can't easily replace. Now, I want to push back a little on the idea that this makes Iran completely powerless, because I don't think that's quite right either, and I think the honest version of this story has to hold both things at once. Iran's naval doctrine wasn't built around ever achieving symmetric parity with the US Navy. It was built around asymmetric denial, decades of investment in anti-ship cruise missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles, armed drones of its own, naval mines, electronic warfare, and swarms of fast attack boats operating out of dispersed coastal bases. None of that disappeared on July 12th. Iran doesn't need to sink an aircraft carrier to achieve a strategic effect in the Strait. It just needs to raise insurance premiums, delay tanker movements, and inject enough uncertainty into global energy markets to make the waterway feel unsafe without ever actually stopping every vessel from transiting it. That's a fundamentally different goal than the one people assume Iran is failing at when they see a headline like this one. It's worth being explicit about that distinction because it's the single most misunderstood part of this entire war. Iran was never trying to win a conventional naval battle against the United States Navy in the way that phrase usually gets pictured, ship against ship, missile against missile, until one side runs out. Iran's entire strategy from the outset has been about making the cost of operating in these waters unpredictable enough that shippers, insurers, and energy markets start pricing in fear even when no single vessel actually gets hit. Judged against that specific goal, rather than against some imagined conventional battle, Iran was never trying to fight. Its strategy has arguably been working in exactly the way it was designed to. Oil price volatility and tanker insurance costs throughout this war are proof enough of that, even while its coastal defenses keep taking real, confirmed damage night after night. And there's a real vulnerability on the American side worth being honest about, too. The scenario that keeps naval planners up at night isn't a single attack. It's a saturation attack, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, one-way aerial drones, unmanned surface vessels, and swarms of fast attack boats all launched at once against the same task group, or the same convoy of escorted tankers. Even an Aegis-equipped guided missile destroyer only carries a finite number of interceptor missiles. Force a commander to defend against enough simultaneous threats at once, and eventually that magazine runs dry faster than it can be resupplied. Naval mines add another layer entirely. Iran maintains one of the largest mine inventories anywhere in the Middle East, and even a modest limited mining operation could disrupt commercial shipping until American and Allied mine countermeasure forces can clear it, and that clearance work takes real time, specialized equipment, and continuous protection against exactly the kind of follow-on attacks we've just spent this entire video talking about. Think about how those two vulnerabilities, Iran's saturation option and America's finite interceptor stockpile, actually interact with each other. Every additional attack axis Iran can bring to bear at once, missiles, drones, mines, fast boats, forces American defenses to spread their limited interceptor inventory across more simultaneous threats. A one-way attack sea drone campaign degrading Iran's radar and surveillance network makes it genuinely harder for Iran to coordinate a large, precisely timed saturation attack in the first place, since coordinating that many simultaneous launches requires exactly the kind of command and control infrastructure this campaign is specifically targeting. That's arguably the real strategic value of hitting the kill chain instead of individual weapons. It doesn't just degrade Iran's ability to hit ships directly, it degrades Iran's ability to ever assemble the kind of coordinated multi-axis saturation attack that would actually threaten to overwhelm American defenses in the first place. There's a longer-term angle to this worth flagging too, because this specific tension, cheap, coordinated multi-axis threats versus finite, expensive interceptor stockpiles, isn't unique to Iran or to this particular war. It's the same underlying problem that showed up during Ukraine's drone campaign against Russia's Black Sea Fleet. And it's the same problem defense planners have been openly discussing for years regarding contested waters in other parts of the world entirely. Whatever doctrine the United States ends up refining here in these narrow, contested waters against Iran is very likely to become the template for how the Navy thinks about defending against exactly this kind of saturation threat. Everywhere else, it might eventually need to. So here's where that leaves the actual strategic picture. One-way attack, sea drones give the United States a genuinely new, low-cost, low-risk option for degrading the specific radar sites, surveillance assets, and fast attack craft that make up Iran's maritime kill chain. That's real. It's already been demonstrated in combat, and it's very likely to become a permanent fixture of American naval operations, not just in the Persian Gulf, but across the Red Sea and the Indo-Pacific as well. Anywhere contested coastal waters make traditional destroyers a riskier tool than they used to be. But it doesn't erase Iran's underlying asymmetric strategy. The mines, the missile inventory, the fast attack boats operating from bases, these strikes haven't fully reached yet. What it does is shift the burden of risk. Where Iran used to be able to count on the United States hesitating before sending a crewed vessel into a dangerous, close-in engagement, that hesitation is a lot smaller now because the vessel doing the dangerous part of the job doesn't have anyone standing on its deck. I think that's genuinely the headline underneath the headline here. This isn't really a story about a single miracle weapon making Iran powerless overnight. It's a story about a cost equation quietly flipping in the middle of an active war in a way that changes what kind of missions get authorized on any given night. And that kind of shift tends to matter a lot more over months than any single dramatic strike does. It also reframes what winning even means in a fight like this one. Nobody expects a handful of autonomous surface vessels to end the war in the Strait of Hormuz by themselves. What they can realistically do is grind down one specific piece of Iran's overall capability, its ability to see, track, and coordinate against ships in these waters. A little more each week at a cost the United States can sustain indefinitely, and Iran has no obvious way to match. Wars built around that kind of slow, compounding attrition rarely have a single dramatic turning point people can point back to later. They just have a long accumulation of nights like July the 12th, each one degrading the same underlying system a little further, until eventually the cumulative effect becomes impossible to ignore. Before I wrap this one up, I want to say something plainly. Every one of these operations, however bloodless the footage looks from a drone's camera feed, is happening inside a war that has already cost real lives on more than one side. Fast attack crews, radar operators, and coastal defense personnel on the Iranian side are the people actually standing near the targets this operation hit. And the American air crews and naval personnel running this entire campaign are still flying repeated combat sorties into contested, actively defended airspace and waters every single night this continues. A weapon that removes risk to one crew doesn't remove risk from the war as a whole, and I don't think this story does its job if it lets the novelty of the technology completely overshadow that. There's also a broader question worth sitting with here, beyond just this specific war. Every time a military reduces the human cost of a given strike option, it also, whether intentionally or not, lowers the threshold for actually choosing to use it. A commander weighing whether to risk sailors' lives over a coastal radar station is making a genuinely difficult decision with real moral weight behind it. A commander deciding whether to send an autonomous vessel that was never coming back anyway is making an easier decision. And easier decisions tend to get made more often. That's not necessarily a criticism of this specific operation. Degrading a functioning military kill chain during an active war is a legitimate use of exactly this kind of capability. But it's worth acknowledging honestly that removing human risk from one side of a war doesn't remove the war itself, and it doesn't remove the consequences landing on the other side of that same equation. Tehran's own state media hasn't offered much public detail on how it plans to specifically counter this new capability, which honestly tells you almost as much as an official response would have. When a government stays quiet about a new enemy weapon, instead of publicly downplaying it the way it usually does, that's often a sign the doctrine to counter it simply isn't ready yet. And that silence out of Tehran, compared to how quickly Tehran has responded to nearly every other escalation in this war, is itself worth paying attention to. There's one more piece of this worth thinking through before you answer that question, and it's the precedent this sets well beyond the Strait of Hormuz. If autonomous surface vessels prove out as a reliable, repeatable way to dismantle a coastal kill chain without risking a single sailor, that's not a lesson that stays contained to this specific war. Every navy watching this conflict, allied and adversarial alike, is taking notes on exactly how effective this turned out to be, how Iran struggled to detect and counter it, and how quickly the underlying technology went from a quietly maturing research program to an actual combat weapon once the right conflict came along. That's the kind of lesson that tends to get absorbed fast by friendly and hostile navies both, and it means whatever happens in these waters over the next few weeks is likely to shape naval doctrine well beyond just this one theater. So, where do you think this actually goes from here? Do you think autonomous surface vessels like this one end up becoming the defining naval weapon of this entire war, the way explosive drones defined the naval fight in the Black Sea? Or do you think Iran's older, deeper investment in mines, missiles, and fast attack boats means the underlying stalemate in the strait doesn't actually change that much, no matter how many radar sites get hit? I'd genuinely like to hear which way you think this leans. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. I pulled this together from CENTCOM's own confirmed statement on the July 12th operation, from reporting on the Navy's Task Force 59 program, and from earlier, confirmed reporting on the Garci unmanned vessel's use during Operation Epic Fury, specifically because I think this is a story that's easy to reduce to a single dramatic sentence and a lot harder to actually explain properly. And we'll keep tracking this one as more of these operations get confirmed, because if this campaign is any indication, this almost certainly won't be the last time we're talking about a sea drone in this war.